It's been a while since the last devlog, and at that point this is where I was at with the game. To quickly recap, this is a game about an Australian swagman wandering from town to town along the coast and surviving along the way. I had infinite procedural terrain generation with some plants and ambiance to fill out the world a little, a system for gathering fuel and making fires, cooking food, a day-night cycle, a way to set up camp and sleep, and I had recently added the ability to spearfish. And that, I think, is where I started to notice things were wrong. The water was the big problem in my game, and I'll explain why and how I ended up getting to water like this. So the game was starting to come along in a sense, but like so many other game devs, I found myself hitting a bit of a wall and lacking motivation. Mostly because the game just wasn't feeling good, and it wasn't capturing the feeling I wanted. I'm aiming mostly for a sort of mix between a relaxing walking simulator and a casual survival game. I want to sort of capture the feeling of fun, beauty, relaxation, and freedom of walking along the seemingly endless Australian coastline. So the game stagnated for a while until I saw the release of Cast and Chill. I didn't play this game and I didn't even really look into it all that much, but I could see instantly that it did one main thing and it did it well. And it made me feel even worse about what was now really feeling like a barely passable spearfishing mechanic. For a game that's about walking along the coastline, the beach and water in my game was just not all that interesting. I don't think it's particularly bad, but really it's just a big rectangle with an animation tacked onto it that moves up and down. It doesn't really capture the feeling of walking along a coastline. If I'm to have spearfishing in my game, it should be incorporated into a pleasurable experience of just walking through the water. I can imagine in Cast and Chill just enjoying being in the boat sitting on the water. I can't imagine that even with polish with what I had. So I felt like I needed to put far more effort into the water in my game and to really focus on making the ocean and what you can do in the ocean the key feature of my game. When I started making progress on this, I finally started to feel like I was getting somewhere again, and I wanted to work on the game again, perhaps a little too much. I had already intended to do a bit of a rewrite at some point because a new version of the game engine I'm using was coming out, Phaser 4, and although very little of the public API was actually changing, the parts that were changing were ones I was heavily using. So I decided to just treat what I had as a bit of an experimental prototype and start fresh on Phaser 4. It's not really a complete rewrite or anything because I'll still be able to utilize a lot of the code I've already written. Before I even get to the water though, I wanted to finally try something I saw in a video by Jess Codes a while ago. I'll link to her video for a much more thorough explanation, but the general idea is if we just use tiles to design the edge transitions and leave the rest as a solid color, we can then supply a much larger texture to a shader, and the shader can then replace those solid colors with the texture. As you can see in the old version of the game, the tiling pattern is quite obvious, and adding variety requires a lot of work. But with this shader approach, I can just keep my existing simple tile set and supply a big texture like this, which allows for a lot of variation. This was just a quick example texture I put together. I'll improve on it later, but you can see how this provides a lot of room for creative freedom. Getting this to work took some trial and error, and I ran into some especially confusing bugs, like the fact that the textures would get messed up in weird ways unless the dimensions of the textures I was using had dimensions that were exactly powers of 2. But I got there in the end with 4 different types of textures by utilizing the red, green, blue, and alpha color channels. So then it was time to move on to my master plan with the water, which all started with this. Now, I highly doubt I'm the first person to come up with this idea, and obviously people use random noise for water all the time. But I had an idea for how I could create the sort of natural coastline effect I was after. I figured I could first create some random noise. What we are looking at here is simplex noise, and as is pretty standard, I could sample this noise and create the water with a shader wherever the lower or darker parts of the texture are. The idea I had that I thought would be cool is that I could animate the depth or darkness that is considered to be water to essentially change the tide and create the sort of natural patterns you might see the ocean create on a beach. Of course, solid red doesn't look so great as water, so I started working on making this look more like water. An important aspect is that I wanted the water shader to still fit in with the pixel art aesthetic of the game, so I started working on making the water effect pixelated. I quickly ran into the limit of my shader skills here and started iterating on the shaders with the help of AI. I have tried this in the past to pretty disappointing results, but either because of my increased knowledge of GLSL shaders now, or maybe it's just that AI is getting better, but either way, I was making good progress. I ended up getting to this, where we have these sort of quantized levels of depth, and even a white line marking what would be the shoreline. The obvious problem here is that it doesn't look like a shoreline at all, as the water is distributed uniformly all over the map. What I need is to create some level of elevation as you move away from the shore. So after adding a sort of gradient drop-off as you get further down the screen, I ended up with this. There was still a long way to go at this point, but this was the first point that I really felt like I was getting somewhere with creating a realistic looking shoreline with a shader. Then I started to incorporate the animation, and although I didn't realize it at first, I was actually drifting away from my initial vision of animating the depth to create a realistic looking tide. This has the same sort of effect as my initial water, where really the ocean is just moving together as one big blob. So I changed gears to refocus on that idea and ended up with this, which, although perhaps unpolished, was basically exactly what I wanted. It creates these realistic looking patterns on the shoreline, and the tide moves in and out in a more natural way. It keeps the pixel art aesthetic, there's even some nice displacement effects going on in the water, and the water gets deeper as you go further down. Just ignore that the player is floating above the water at this point. I could even modify this shader a bit to create a tide animation where the water would push in further up the shore in a rather natural pattern. I've sped this example up. In game, the tide would push in much more slowly over the course of the day. So I thought I was done at this point, but in perhaps a good sign that I was onto something good, I just wanted to keep working on it more and more. And not in a, oh man, this sucks, I gotta fix it kind of way, but an, oh man, this is cool, I wonder if I could add this kind of way. I ended up working on this water for more than a week in total, and eventually I got to this point. I added in this damp sand effect near where the tide is, a caustic texture to the surface of the water that is also animated, and if you look closely you'll notice this caustic texture gets distorted to simulate waves gently rolling in. Near the shoreline these waves will break, but deeper into the water you can only notice them as subtle distortions in the water as they travel by. Now if I walk back out of the water you'll notice that I've added another shader to handle making the player sprite wet. And there is also a dripping effect. If I go all the way into the deep water and back out again, you can see our swagman gets drenched from head to toe. Right now this is just a visual effect, but I will be incorporating this wetness and dryness mechanic into the game. Another thing I really like about this more natural approach to the water is that we get these random little sandbar, island sort of things within the water, and just general depth variations throughout the water, which feels a lot more natural than just a linear gradient drop-off as the player moves downward. There are a few other subtle effects I've added that I haven't discussed, so drop a comment if you notice them, but overall I'm really happy with where this is at now, and I have a ton of ideas to expand on this further and really make the water a key aspect of the game. Of course, feel free to drop a comment with anything you do or don't like about the water, or any thoughts or suggestions. If you like this video, a like or subscribe before you go would be greatly appreciated, and I hope to see you back here for the next one.